you for coming out. My name is Monterey Gardner. I just started at NREL just a few weeks ago, and actually I came from Zero Avia, so my Zero Avia colleagues are here going to speak next. But just to start this off, I think the target was 5 minutes, but I may go over, but I'll go as fast as I can. So I'm local. I grew up in Sonoma, off-grid, so we had a Honda generator and used that for lights and a 12-volt battery in the back of the truck. I did work with Shots Energy early in my career, so through AC Transit and some of their work with J11. So I've been kind of local for a long time, but I've been around the world. I was on the East Coast with DOE for about 7 years, a 2-year sabbatical in Japan, and then 7 years with BMW, where I was also 2 years in Japan, and now 10 years to the day back to the Bay Area. So excited to be here local and to see everything that's happening around hydrogen. I've been in this for a long time. So at NREL, it's a National Renewable Energy Laboratory. It's very focused. It's of the 17 labs that are looking at cleaning up nuclear messes or taking care of nuclear weapons. It's the only national lab that's solely focused on renewable energy. So I'm really grateful to be working there. And I work in this ECAS. It's the Energy Conversion, Energy Storage System Center. And I work with Jen Kurtz. She's the center director. And I just came on to support strategy and partnerships. And I've already found a company that wants to work with NREL. So I'm really happy to be here. And I think I've already taken my 5 minutes. So I'm going to talk briefly about renewable energy, carbon, and then jump into hydrogen storage. And something that's near and dear to my heart, it's one of the highest density hydrogen storage options. It's called high pressure hydrogen cryocompressed. So I'll run through a long timeline. Looks like we have a guest who's going to listen to this. So just to jump into this, so to remind everyone, I'm sure you guys have had the California fires with the darkened skies, right? We had the spring floods in California up on the peninsula. So anybody know how much tax revenue California might bring in? $1 billion? I don't know. Several hundred? $200 billion. And they put that out until, right, in just a couple weeks. They put a hold for collecting taxes, gave a tax holiday. So, right, these floods are having really big impacts on the communities, right? You imagine the interest on $200 million for the state and what they're giving up and delaying those returns. We also had hurricanes in Nevada, right? It's been almost 100 years where there was enough tropical storm energy made its way inland all the way to Nevada with threats of flooding and so on. And then the heat domes, polar vortex, right? We had the natural gas generators freezing in Texas just a couple years ago, and they almost had a brownout, right? They complained about that in California, but it's happening in Texas as well. And then the Florida coastal waters, right? Getting to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, right? That's like a hot tub, but it's off the coast. It is a small bay, but just major changes to our environment, and it's just gonna get worse, I believe. So what do? Right? I think we need to build out renewable energy as fast as we can, and that's coming on the next slide. We also need a more robust network. I guess folks are familiar with PG&E, right? And some of the efforts to bury lines. But as we build out these renewables, it's tough when we look at flooding, fires, right? Wind, all of these issues, right? How do you make a stable enough grid that's going to go cross country or cross state? So microgrids is one way of dealing with that. Is anybody here familiar with microgrids? It's fairly been in the press quite a bit, right? But just being able to prioritize your load, how do you bring that on-site generation, whether it's a mix of renewables, fossils, how do you prioritize your freezer over your TV, over your router, right, versus industry. So I think self-generation in the hundreds of kilowatts, and then how do you figure out that storage behind the meter? So I think that's all I'm going to say here, and I'm just about at 5 minutes. So wind and solar, right? That's the direction we need to go if we're serious about carbon. So just, you can look at, right, this is the Mauna Loa Observatory. So this is for NOAA, where for right? 60 years they've been monitoring ppm levels of CO2, and you can just see it's going straight up. So even with COVID, right, it barely was a blip, it was within the noise. So where we had, right, a year and a half where everybody was staying home, not driving, economies around the world were going down. And it's, right, we really need to build out renewables. The good news is that in 2021, wind and solar overtook coal in national generation. So we're on that path. Nuclear energy is about the same, around 20%, just a bit less. The energy, EIA, Energy Information Agency, it's a subset of DOE, which captures all of the electricity generation for the US. It's a really good resource for learning more. But on the resource at the end of this where they talked about it, Texas, the amount of wind in Texas, there's a strip of purple high-speed wind through the middle of the US, so all through the Midwest down to Texas. 25% of all wind electricity produced in the US came from Texas. And reversed, 25% of all of the solar electricity utility scale produced in the US came from California. So it shows that really large, high amounts of renewable can be built out. And then the question is, what do you do when you get that much variable generation, right? You only get 5 hours a day of solar that you can really count on, maybe a bit more. Wind might be a little bit more, right? You can get 30, 50% capacity factor as you look at nameplate and you get to bigger swept areas. But one of the options is hydrogen. I think we're going to hear more about that from Hiwatt and others, right? What do you do with that excess electricity? You're going to build out batteries. Anybody know how many gigawatts are down in Moss Landing?
It's like 500 megawatts, I think, right?
Yeah, I think it's maybe a bit more. I heard numbers like 3 gigawatts around that. There's a Volts podcast, and they said what's really interesting about that battery storage connected to the grid, it's about ancillary services and making money to pay for those expensive batteries. It's not about reducing carbon. So California is pretty good, right? We're already on our way to 60% renewable energy by 2030, but other parts of the country which are installing batteries, it doesn't necessarily mean we're reducing carbon. So when you take that over generation, that same ancillary services to make sure you get frequency regulation, voltage regulation, and so on, you can do that with an electrolyzer. So I think electrolytic hydrogen is a good way, and it's a way of linking to the transportation sector. Any questions, or I'm going to go way over time, but I'll run through this. So I apologize, this is definitely a deep dive, right? We went from renewables all across the country down to what do we do with that excess hydrogen. One way of dealing with it is liquefaction. This is a phase diagram, so right now there are two kind of competing technologies for storing liquid on board an airplane or for trucks, heavy duty use. So you can do kind of low pressure, moderate pressure liquid, or you can have a high pressure tank, it's cryocompressed. So over here, as this is still well within cryogenics, right? Way out at 300 is room temperature. But you can use a CCH2, this cryocompressed tank, can be used with any liquid station, and that tank can go all the way up to warm room temperature, but because it's at pressure, upwards of 300 bar, you'll always have 50% of your range available. So it's a nice compromise. Daimler has already started testing out a station with subcooled liquid, but it has to be kept very cold. It's still single flow, so these are two competing technologies for high density storage. There are challenges around vacuum, lifetime performance of that tank, and maybe with a low pressure liquid tank, and probably in aviation long term, you really want a lightweight storage, so you'll go to the thinnest wall tank you can use. But in the meantime, there are some technologies that are looking at carbon on carbon, where you have a carbon fiber inner tank that is cryogenic compatible, and then the outer shell for that vacuum insulation, like your thermos, can also be carbon. So there may be some future opportunities. I think variable fill level is another one of the challenges for the end user, right? If you, depending on how hot that tank is when it comes into the station, you may get a different level of fill, and after kind of 3 times through the station, you go back up to the maximum from that halfway point. But this is just a touch on it, and I'm happy to talk to people more later. But I think the next steps are really confirming that these really high densities where you can get more than liquid hydrogen, which is around 70 kilograms per cubic meter, is where the opportunity is for those long distance, long haul trucking. I think somebody had asked about the cost of fueling stations for hydrogen, and it is right around $1 million. It could be more or less, right? These are numbers, there's been inflation. But the real question is that throughput. So I like to think about hydrogen cars. We're kind of done with that, but it's zero emissions for the rest of us who don't have our own single family home. We don't have a garage until we get every single parking lot. We don't have induction charging at every parking space. LA's been working on that with light poles and so on. But as you look to long range, if you want to go fast and you want to go far, I think hydrogen is one of the ways to go. And that's what cryocompressed offers. So this is my last slide. I think I'm over time. I apologize, down here. But Lawrence Livermore National Lab, just over the hill, across the street from Sandia, they've been working on this for more than 20 years. They worked with a Prius, a hydrogen combustion engine Prius, very simple to convert. You had to change out the valves and ports, so it wasn't totally an answer. And there's NOx, nitrous oxides is an emission if you don't get the combustion steam and down completely. But in 2010, 2009, they had a third generation tank that they put together. And then they put in the first fueling station, a cryocompressed fueling station in Livermore. So that was a Lindy pump technology. They use that in South Carolina. They have 600 forklifts for building those 10,000 SUVs a year. I'm probably getting the numbers off, but South Carolina, Spartanburg is where some of this technology has been used. 2013, BMW started working with Toyota, and then they're just now releasing the iX5, so it's got a Toyota collaborative fuel cell from BMW. There's 100 vehicles out there for showing this as the kind of the next generation. Does anybody know when California wants to start selling combustion vehicles?
2035.
Yeah, all right. So it's coming, and BMW is waiting for that time frame. When do they really have to get serious about the transition? So the last line, just in the last few years, Vern is a startup company in Sacramento that's taking some of that technology out of the labs, trying to commercialize it for trucks. And then BMW, the former manager, has got Cryomotive, which is out of Munich. And so they're both competing and started at the same time. Daimler is putting together their station, looking at the subcooled liquid that I talked about briefly. Hyzon Motors and Chart, they all have a fuel cell truck, so they're also looking, have tested here in California for long haul trucking. And coming up in the next month, there's going to be a cryocompressed workshop, and then a little bit more after that to show the advantages of how it can reduce the station costs significantly. Oh, and questions? Yes?
Is NREL looking at the use of batteries from electric vehicles for backup supply to the solar?
I just started, and when I had worked at BMW in the past, we were looking at second life batteries, and I'm sure there are efforts to look at that. It's the question about when you have an automated line, as technology is going up exponentially, right? You have raw materials coming in one end, and say in 5 years, there's no human touching that through the construction cycle. But when you look at an iPhone, or right, old Android phones where you could remove the battery, it was no problem. Those batteries are glued in, right? It's poured in with epoxy and whatever else. So to be able to take that battery apart and make sure that everything is there, if there's cells or issues, that can be a challenge as technology costs come down for second life batteries. And the second one is warranty. How do you evaluate the battery, and who takes on the warranty when it comes out of those cars? So I'm sure there are research efforts at NREL that are looking at second life batteries, but I see you shaking your head, and you're gonna tell me what's
I don't
wrong.
mean second life, I mean when it's in the car. When it's still in the car, you can, bi-directional charging.
Like vehicle to grid.
Oh, sure. I think that's what I was getting at here, is if you're gonna have a microgrid, right, if you're not driving and you're not at work, then yeah, it's great to have it as a temporary storage. misunderstood. Another question?
How many hydrogen fueling stations are there in California now?
So right now there's 50, but maybe 10% aren't working. There's a web app where you can see where it's going. I think more than 60, 70 have been funded, and they're planning on at least to 200. I heard this number through 2025. So yeah, 50 stations is a round number, but it kind of fluctuates as more come online.
Is it private money that's building them or government money?
I think it's 50-50, or maybe it's 20% government, 80% private. I'm not sure exactly what the share is. Yeah,
And just to follow up on that question,
sure.
how much of that money is allocated to maintenance?
For the station?
Yes.
I don't have those numbers. I know in the past, and NREL collected composite data, so you can see where the challenge is for uptime, and one of them is the compression and the compressors, how often you have to change those seals, and that's one of the reasons I'm really pro gung-ho on liquid hydrogen, is it takes much less energy, and there's less time between maintenance for a cryo pump than a gaseous compressor. But those numbers are available out there.
Do you have a